Hello, my name is Kate Drabinski, and I'm here with Ideas on Fire for today's webinar, Navigating Imposter Syndrome and Other Insecurities. I think it's the time of year when imposter syndrome, for a lot of us on the job market or with writing deadlines right now, can really be at its worst. So we thought that now would be a good time to have a webinar talking about this. So the way this will work is in a second, I will go away and pull up the slides and talk through them for about the next 30 to 45 minutes. And then I'll come back here. And if you have anything you'd like to discuss, you can type it in that little text column that's on the side of your screen. All right, so I will be back soon. And thank you for joining us today. Okay, so today's webinar, again, is called Navigating Imposter Syndrome and Other Insecurities. We're going to start today talking about what imposter syndrome is and some ideas about where it comes from. Not that we need to get to the root of the cause of it to understand it, but it can be helpful to reflect a little bit on where it comes from. Then we'll talk about some strategies for dealing with it. First, we'll talk about building a network for defense against imposter syndrome. Then we'll talk about changing our self-talk, because a lot of what imposter syndrome is the stories we're telling ourselves. So how might we change those stories? Then we'll talk a little bit about using our research skills to build a case against imposter status that can help us as we try and sort of change our language around this. Next, we'll talk about strategies for dealing with insecurities that just won't go away. Sometimes all the self-talk and support in the world doesn't actually silence those voices. Then we'll talk about finding help when you need it, how to tell the difference between a moment of imposter syndrome where you just need a little support from a friend and when it's time to seek professional help. And then we'll end today by talking about trusting ourselves and when we can't. All right, so that's what we're going to do in today's webinar. So we won't spend much time on this, because if you're watching this, chances are you know exactly what we're talking about when we talk about imposter syndrome. And they're those feelings that you don't belong and that everyone's about to find out that you're a fraud and that you're here because people made mistakes over and over and over again. And everyone's just moments away from discovering the truth. And that's and that's sort of what imposter syndrome is. And it sometimes can be a way to motivate us to do more work, to get back into our studies, but oftentimes it's something that's really a block, and it can freeze us from doing our work. So where does it come from? What's the sort of cause of it? I think that a lot of imposter syndrome comes from our past experiences and the way that we've been sort of subtly taught over time that we're maybe not good enough. And this is sometimes because of actual experiences, and sometimes because of being, just our very identities can open us up to being taken less seriously, and that can sort of build up over time and have a really profound psychological effect. Also, I think when talking about imposter syndrome, it's important to remember that imposter syndrome partly comes from an academy that produces and nurtures those feelings. We're often in incredibly competitive environments. We were to get into graduate school, we're always fighting for funding. If we're looking for jobs, we're sort of throwing our hat into a ring with hundreds of applicants and then blaming ourselves when we don't get a job, right? It can be, and that's all part of the academy working like it's supposed to, unfortunately. So those feelings, while they are individual and they shape our own experiences, they also come from this larger structure called the academy. I think it's worth thinking about the roots of each of our own individual insecurities, sort of where they come from, just to get a sense of a kind of a rational understanding or grasp of where these feelings come from, and an understanding that that doesn't mean that they're true. But that's all well and good. We're probably not going to get rid of imposter syndrome today. So let's talk about some strategies for dealing with it when it crops up. I wanted to start by talking about building a network of defense. And by this, I mean figuring out when these feelings and insecurities are most likely to pop up, and then what kind of group of people or what kind of practices can you develop to sort of defend yourself against those feelings. So first, get a sense of your own insecurities, and this can just be jotting down some notes for a while, for a few weeks or a month or a semester, and sort of seeing when they come and go. When are they most present? Is it around deadlines? Is it around transition periods? Is what's sort of the thing that pokes it? Is it always about writing? Is it about teaching? What's sort of the trigger? And then you might want to spend some time thinking about where they come from for you. That said, sometimes for some of us, it doesn't matter where it comes from, just that it's here. So if getting to the root cause of your insecurities is a project you're sort of up for, it can really be worth doing that work. So you can figure out sort of how to circumvent those feelings. That said, if that's not a project that's on your plate, that's fine. We don't have to solve problems to sort of deal with them. And then think about your own goals for dealing with your insecurities. What sort of do you hope to accomplish in sort of dealing with these? Is it to get rid of them for good, or is it to figure out how to let them pass? Just figure out what your goals are. And sort of once you get a sense of, okay, this is something I'm going to take seriously as a problem or hurdle to sort of jump over, right? What kind of team can you assemble to help you deal with these insecurities? So who can you talk honestly with about your insecurities? Sometimes this is a colleague, but a lot of times it's not. There's something about the academy that can feed off of other people's insecurities, right? And can give even the best of friends. Sometimes these talking about our own insecurities inside the academy with other academics can sometimes make it worse. But if you can find people who can relate, I think that that's really helpful for sort of building a community to talk openly about these feelings of insecurity. So who might be on your support team? I think trusted colleagues are really important, and these are often colleagues not in your own department, because there can sometimes be conflicts sort of built in there. So it might be faculty members from other departments. A lot of times, if new cohorts of faculty at a university might have introductions and sort of beginning of your career networking events, and other people who are new on the job can often be a good circle of trusted colleagues who might not have the sort of political issues of being somebody in your department. It's also worth thinking about your friends outside the academy. Sometimes as academics, we can imagine that people who aren't academics just don't get it. But if you talk to folks outside the academy, as we all do, I'm sure, you'll notice that a lot of the issues of imposter syndrome that we have, people outside the academy have those as well. And they can be great, people can be great sounding boards, especially when they have the perspective of someone who's not sort of completely tied up with the politics and language of the academy. And then also professional help, I think, is important to mention here. When insecurities become sort of binding in a way that keeps us from doing what we want to do, seeking professional help, a therapist, a counselor, a support group can be really helpful. And so that's sort of talking about how to build a team you can talk to about this. But ultimately, I think that a lot of imposter syndrome is stuff that we have to work through on our own. A lot of it comes from our own self-talk. Very, and it might be supported sometimes by microaggressions that can make us feel like we don't belong somewhere, right? So that is a sort of external factor that produces a lot of insecurities. At the same time, there's a way that we often can talk ourselves into a place where we don't belong. So listen to your inner voice and what it's telling you when it's telling you you're an imposter. What is sort of, what's its evidence? What kind of a case does it make? Is it rooted in any kind of rational ideas, right? Is it like you haven't published enough, so obviously you're not good enough? Sort of, what is the voice? And then think about what makes it so compelling. Why Why is that voice correct instead of all the voices that have said, yes, you belong? So many voices have to say that for you to get to the point of even being um, in the academy in a kind of full-time way. So what is it that makes it so compelling? And then think about some other things to say to yourself in those moments of insecurity. Uh, the first thing I think is really important to keep in mind is how important it is to be compassionate with ourselves when we have these feelings. Imposter syndrome, I think, can be particularly damaging when we listen to it, and we know it's not true that we're imposters, and then we become angry with ourselves for having those feelings in the first place. Oh, I can't believe I'm wasting my time with this. If I could just get over this, I could really write. Kind of being angry with ourselves for having these feelings. They're completely normal. They're part of what the academy does to us, some of the terrible things that the academy does to us. So having those feelings doesn't need to be a moment of resistance, right? You can recognize the feeling and then let it pass. This is sort of letting it pass through rather than being something that inhabits us and keeps us from doing our work. That's sort of what we want to resist. When we're thinking about how to talk to ourselves differently when we're having these feelings of imposter syndrome, I think it's helpful to remind ourselves of all the ways and signs that we do belong. You know, uh, this is how I did in college, right? I was a good writer there. I got into graduate school. It's really competitive and hard to get in. And these things aren't just chance. I was selected, right? Thinking about the evidence that you do belong, right? I got this job. I got this thing published. People ask me to, think about what you've actually done. That's proof that you're not an imposter, because most of the time we can recognize the irrationality of imposter syndrome, but give yourself and write down a list of evidence that you do belong and return to that in these moments of insecurity. I think it's also worth considering a mantra or something that you can repeat to yourself in these moments of insecurity, that, I do belong. I'm here and I'm going to stay, right? Something just that simple to sort of remind yourself that, yes, these feelings are normal. They will pass. I belong here. And these are techniques that I think we have to practice, sort of letting the feeling come through, pass through, recognize it, be compassionate with it, and then let it go, right? And we get better at that as we practice changing our self-talk. And these are sort of the strategies I think we can use in those freezing moments of insecurity. All right, so I wanted to extend a little bit on this idea of making a case for yourself that you can refer to when you're feeling insecure to remind yourself you're not an imposter. And this, I think, is important to actually write down. So a couple of sort of ideas here. First, keep a list of things that you've done, and not just a CV, but just a list. Sometimes it can be helpful to keep a list of tasks you've completed in a week, right? If your feelings are, I'll never be able to keep up, or I don't work hard enough, or I'm so lazy, that's why I don't belong. Keep track of what you're actually doing. That's a good thing to refer to recognize that, yes, you are a hardworking person. There's just a lot to do. Keep a list of conferences that you've attended, email requests for information from colleagues, which is a sign that they trust you and value your guidance. Keep a list of publications and good students and accolades, right? All the things that the sort of markers and taps that remind us that we do belong here, in spite of the microaggressions that tell us we don't, or our own feelings, right? Sometimes it's also helpful to have a list of the gatekeepers who've let you through the gate, right? So you can trust that, it might be your dissertation advisor who kept working with you, or the undergraduate professors who pointed you in the direction of graduate school. So many gatekeepers have said yes for you to get there. Write those names down. Remind yourself you can trust them. They had a chance. to notice you were an imposter, and they didn't. So you're not. I think this is super important, and I have a file in my filing cabinet in my office where I save thank you notes from students and colleagues. If I get a email from a student after a class has ended saying, "Oh, that was a great experience," whatever, I'll print it out and put it in that file. And so those days when I feel really down and like I really don't belong, that file, just pull it open and read some words from other people that sort of affirm your belongingness, right? And that people are grateful you're here. Uh, and on this note, I wanted to note that we also can spend time supporting each other in this. I think as academics, we don't thank each other enough for the work that we do or recognize the labor and the intelligence that we get from our colleagues. So if you have time, write a thank you note to someone to put in their file, because everyone's going through these feelings. They're totally normal. And then, look for other evidence that you belong, and write that down, right? Actually have this stuff written out and refer to it when you have those feelings of being an imposter or those insecurities. So I wanted to sort of move now for insecurities that feel like they just won't go away. And I think that if you're sort of in a space of writer's block, for example, the insecurity that nothing I write will be good enough, or the sort of sense that if I write it, everyone will know the truth, that I really don't know what I'm talking about, or whatever. Those kind of insecurities that have such a grip on us that we can't just sort of let them go. I think it's a good idea to think about when those insecurities recur. Is it around writing and research? Is that where those insecurities are? Are those insecurities around teaching? This can sort of, where they recur can give you a sense of what kind of support you need to get over those humps and those senses of insecurity. Do you need the feedback of students? Do you need what sort of help will get you through these? And if the insecurities recur, those moments when we don't feel at home in hostile institutions, or the institutions making very subtle but clear arguments that we don't really belong, when we those kind of insecurities that recur, I think that's a moment when one really wants to think about how to build a network of scholars who are in a similar situation at the institution, and really try to form a place where we can feel at home in institutions that sometimes seem like they don't want us. I want to talk about a few things about what if those insecurities are telling the truth. And this is always the part of our self-talk against imposter syndrome that's really hard, sort of that rationalizing back into panic that actually we really aren't good enough, and all those things that we wrote down about our accomplishments, there's something false there. And the real truth is that we don't belong. So what if those insecurities are telling the truth? First of all, they're not, right? We can have insecurities, feelings of that we're not good enough, but that doesn't mean that they're true, right? That's just not true once and for all for any of us. But what if they are a little bit? Like, I'm thinking about insecurities around teaching. Maybe I'm not doing a great job at teaching right now. And what if I get my course evaluations back? And I understand that course evaluations are not necessarily a good judge of teaching, but if they're really in the can, or they're not as good as usual, maybe that's evidence. Maybe I'm not doing a great job. And I think that it's important here to recognize that our insecurities, and sometimes we don't have to be good at that thing all the time, which is, I know, kind of a wild thing to say, but I think it's helpful to remember that we don't have to get an A in everything. Maybe I'm not the greatest teacher right now. Maybe this piece of writing that I need to get off my desk, I need to send in, I'm not completely proud of it. That's okay, right? That's part of being fallible in the world, right? So sometimes remembering that having some struggle or being not amazing at something is not the same thing as being an imposter. That's just part of how we all have different skill sets. And then finally, just remember that insecurities and imposter syndrome can coexist with an absolutely fabulous career. And periods of writer's block are normal, and periods of feeling like really in a rut about teaching are all totally normal. So I find those, remembering those things to be really helpful in dealing with insecurities that are super persistent. And then I next want to talk about the importance of finding help when you need it, because as as we all know, imposter syndrome is a completely normal part of an academic's life, especially in institutions that are often hostile to ourselves and our work and our demand to have life outside of the institution, right? It can be these are just our sort of accompaniments. There are partners in a lot of academic life. So the issue is when it gets in the way of our work and life. And I just wanted to say that professional help can really help in these areas and these insecurities, and give you sort of the moment of checking in with an external source to get support for these recurrent feelings. Traditional talk therapy, if you have access to that on your campus or off campus, is incredibly helpful here. Group support networks for faculty in similar situations, right? So, for example, where I teach, we have a women's faculty network, and it's feminist faculty from all over the institution, and it's been a great support for helping us get sort of work together to come up with strategies for surviving the insecurities that a lot of us face that come from that identity. I wanted to also mention mindfulness training, which is, it's a sort of a buzzword, but I do think that mindfulness can be really helpful for learning how to sort of develop compassion for negative thoughts. And compassion, and then also the ability to let those negative thoughts go. And then finally, look at your institution and see if they have resources. And I think there are often more resources than we think. If there are faculty associations, like I mentioned, a women's faculty network or an LGBTQ or African American faculty networks are often places where we can find really good supports. And some institutions increasingly are recognizing the need for support groups for, say, mid-career faculty or new faculty. And those can be great places to, I think, make connections and find some real help. And I wanted to end today by talking about sort of ways to trust ourselves, and also the importance of reminding ourselves of the ways that we can't really trust ourselves. Navigating imposter syndrome and other insecurities takes an incredible amount of practice. These aren't feelings that are, I think, ever going to go away once and for all, and that's okay. So rather than thinking about this as how do I get rid of imposter syndrome, I think that's why we chose this idea of navigating imposter syndrome, like learning to work with it. Right? It's your partner here. Also, trust that feelings will pass. The feelings of being an imposter are temporary. They are not a constant drumbeat for most of us throughout our career. It comes and goes. And just remember that means that it goes, right? Don't trust the imposter syndrome voice. That voice is a liar. That's a way that we can't trust ourselves, right? That voice is lying to us, and we need to figure out how to sort of put the mute button on it. And it can be helpful to sort of trust that you do belong, that a lot of choices have been made to sort of get you where you are. And a lot of people have tapped and said, yes, you belong here. So to focus on those taps rather than the ways that an institution makes you feel like you don't belong, I think can be really helpful. And then finally, just remember that insecurities are feelings and they're not truths, right? So sometimes all it takes to get rid of that feeling is just to, do a little shout to your social media folks and say, hey, I feeling insecure. Remind me why I belong here. Right? Can let people tell you those truths instead of listening necessarily to those feelings. So that's today's webinar on navigating imposter syndrome. To learn about upcoming webinars, join our newsletter. These slides will go out with the webinar replay, so you can click on that then. All right, so I'm going to return now to the camera in a minute. Okay. Hello, I'm back. So that's today's webinar on navigating imposter syndrome. Thank you so much for joining us today or whenever you're watching this webinar. And does anyone have any questions or thoughts or strategies that or mantras that you use to deal with these feelings? All right, well, thank you for joining us, and we will see you at a future webinar. Thank you.